and welcome to the At Peace Parents podcast. I'm Casey, and I'm here to empower you in your decision-making as a parent of a demand-avoidant child. My goal is to share insights that will generate aha moments and support your connection with your child. I'm a mom of two amazing little boys, one of whom is PDA, and I've worked with hundreds of parents just like you to teach them how to lead their child out of burnout and find the clarity, peace, and sense of community they need. So welcome everybody. I'm so happy you're here to share this afternoon with Kendahl. And I'm just going to read her bio real quick and then hand over the microphone to her. Today's session will be about internalized PDA and her story. So Kendahl Damashek brings her unique experience as a gifted PDA autistic mother, raising 4 PDA humans under the age of 10, to her work as a coach and educator as part of At Peace Parents. She has an educational background in psychology and neuroscience and a BA from Amherst College. Kendahl was a lead research assistant on a project studying therapeutic alliance at UMass Amherst and worked with middle school children in San Francisco before focusing her energy and creativity on parenting and caregiving. Kendahl specializes in supporting parents with 2E, children, twice exceptional PDA children, gifted and PDA, and larger or more complex family dynamics. She brings her warmth, compassion, passion, and logical brain to her area of expertise, supporting parents to unpack the complexity of their situation with creative solutions and needle-moving insights. And I will just say that I met Kendahl in the Paradigm Shift program. She was amazing, and I was like, who is this woman that I'm learning from? Well, giving the course, and I asked if she wanted to be part of the following Paradigm Shift program in the community, and things have evolved from there, and now she's part of the team, and I think this is the 4th cohort that you've worked in?
3rd or 4th, I can't remember. Yeah.
So it's just been a joy to work alongside her, and I'm so happy that we get to spend 90 minutes together. So I'll hand it over to Kendahl. Thank you, Kendahl.
Yeah, thank you, Casey. I first just want to thank all of you for being here. I know that it is not easy to step away or even sometimes to just have an AirPod in one ear. So thank you, everyone, for being here. And I also just want to thank you all, too. It's been amazing to work with you as a cohort and each of you as individuals in the community. I think this is such a compassionate, hardworking, insightful group of parents. And I just feel really lucky to be walking alongside all of you during what I know from experience is a very intense and vulnerable process. So I came into PDA for myself as well. I did not identify as PDA or even neurodivergent before exploring things for my kids. And then, was reading things and I was like, oh, wait, a lot of this describes me. Perhaps there are some similarities here and I should look into my own profile and see what connects for me. So today I'm going to basically walk through my life story as it relates to PDA and being an internalized PDAer. I know that a lot of times what we hear as examples anywhere in social media or from others are examples of, externalized PDAers, which is that's how I first came to PDA, was because one of my kids is very externalized, right? But I know that I have felt curious in my own journey about hearing other people's experiences who are internalized PDAers. So I thought I would share that. And I'll start kind of first with my young childhood and also how my parents accommodated me as a kid, look at kind of how I naturally used what I realize now are the 4 S's to kind of support my own regulation. I'll talk a little bit about my own experiences of dysregulation as an internalized PDAer, because a lot of times we don't see it from the outside, but there is something going on the inside. So just to shed some light on that in my own personal experience, at least. And then how I realized in adulthood my own need for accommodation. And I'll talk a bit about what that looks like. How do I accommodate myself? I'll talk about finding my agency, and finally about kind of finding my guiding purpose or my light and how that's affected what my life looks like now, especially compared to how it looked, a year and a half ago. So in hindsight, when I think about growing up, there were probably lots of signs that I was PDA, even from a very young age. I had colic, which is like the main thing that my mom remembers about my infancy. Words that I have heard my family describing me in my childhood include like stubborn and self-assured and literal. I was very bossy, was always bossing around my playmates. I was very certain about what it was that we should be cooking in my play kitchen or the preschool play kitchen. I had totally logical reasoning as to why I was the one who was supposed to be playing Ariel in our, imaginary play of The Little Mermaid, because I'm the one with red hair. My friend had the one with the blue and white striped shirt, so obviously she should be Flounder. There was no negotiation. I was selectively mute in my first preschool. I told this story on the podcast recently, but my school didn't even know that I could speak. And I was hyperlexic. I was reading at 3 and very verbal from the age of like 9 or 10 months. And at preschool, they didn't know that I could speak until, my mom was probably about 6 months pregnant. And one of the preschool teachers said, "Oh, we heard that your mommy has a baby in her tummy." And I said, "No, she has a baby in her uterus." That was like the first thing that they'd heard me say, which was like very equalizing. I had really intense tantrums as a kid, and my mother used extinction to extinguish them. She would like literally like step over my body and completely ignore me until I spoke in a big girl voice. I was not aware of my surroundings. I was unaware of danger. Even up through the age of like 11 or 12, my mom worried about me crossing the street safely. Around when I was maybe 3, I eloped in the Los Angeles Zoo, which if any of you have ever been there, it's like a city unto itself. And I didn't come out from hiding for like 20 minutes, even though I could hear my mom screaming for me. It was flight. I was underneath one of the picnic tables, and I didn't come out for like 20 minutes. And when I was upset, I would shut myself in my room. So after I wasn't tantruming externally anymore, I would shut myself in my room and I would bite my arm hard enough to leave a mark. And even in elementary school, like when it was a particularly hard day at school, I would equalize. So like, this is horrible, but I would collect earthworms from the playground and I would put them on the desk of a girl that I didn't like, who was like a popular girl, and felt very good about it. So I spent an inordinate amount of time in my head. I didn't really seek out friendships, even though I liked people and I enjoyed spending time with them and they liked me. It wasn't something that I went out and did. I didn't initiate interactions or friendships, and I wasn't super expressive, though I was really polite. I used to take on the mannerisms, and I grew up in LA, and there's like, you'll hear me saying like a lot, there's Valley Girl accent. So I would take on the Valley Girl accent and like vocabularies of my friends, even though naturally my speech was very bookish. And it's because it seemed to me that this was like the right thing to do in a group. Like everybody was talking the same, so I should talk like them, not really understanding that that's just how they talked and I was different, right? And when I would get home from play dates, I would collapse in my bed. My parents would describe me as almost comatose. So I'd be like really engaged in the social interaction and I'd come home just for hours on my bed, not moving. But there were also positive indicators too. So I say those because I say that, the negative indicators, because I think those are the things that we identify first, like, oh yeah, that's PDA, right? But there are also really positive indicators of me being PDA as a kid too. Like, according to my family, from the second that I was born, I was observant. I was looking around at everything. My dad, my grandma, my grandpa would all tell stories about how they would go to the nursery and see all the babies sleeping, and I was wide awake and I couldn't move my head, but I was like looking at everyone. I was making eye contact and interacting even as a newborn. I've always been comfortable with experimentation and creative problem solving, and because I never felt the need to be like part of the group, and in fact always have felt more comfortable outside of it, it always felt easy to stand up for myself and to stand up for others. So, like, for instance, one summer after 3rd grade, I went to sleepaway camp for a week, and one of my cabin mates had cerebral palsy, and she was difficult to understand, and she used a wheelchair. And most of my cabin ignored her or made fun of her. So, like, the easy decision for me was to befriend her. And it felt very natural to go against the grain to do the thing that I knew was right. I think that's a very PDA thing to do. And we had a great week together, just, in the California sun, eating popsicles by the pool and like making lanyards. And I didn't mind that I was separated from the main group. Now I'm going to move into talking about how my parents accommodated me. I have often wondered, looking at my own kids, especially my more externalized ones, like, okay, if I'm also PDA, why weren't my parents like tearing their own hair out in desperation? Why do they remember me as like this perfect child? Why wasn't I trying to kill my sister? Why wasn't I screaming at my parents well past toddlerhood? And why didn't anybody notice that I had a different neurotype? I think there are a number of reasons for this, some of which might just be genetic. Part of it, I think, is my natural tendency toward internalization and appeasement as a nervous system response. But I think part of it too is that my parents were very naturally accommodating. So both of my parents are musicians. They're both creative artist types. My dad's a composer. My mom's a flutist. They've never been ones to fit inside the box themselves. My dad was suspended from school multiple times as a child and only not expelled because his dad was on the board of his private school. My mom ran away from home at 15. She lived by a stream under the stars until she built her own house with her own two hands, like before the time of YouTube. And both of my parents came from really well-educated, relatively affluent, pressure-filled families, and they weren't keen to pass on that pressure to their kids. So what did this look like? Well, in elementary school, my mom would often do my homework for me because in her words, it was stupid and not worth my time. And she really liked coloring. So she would just literally be like, she would go through my folder and be like, this isn't worth you doing. I'll color this for you. You go do something else. And without exaggeration, my dad probably said yes to every idea I've ever had, ever. He would spend hours with me doing imaginary play, where I was the boss and controlled the storylines completely. My mom repeatedly told me that she didn't care whether I got A's or F's in school as long as I did my best. And doing my best didn't mean killing myself. It just meant like I put in effort how I could put in effort. My parents never made me stick it out with anything. And school was always kind of challenging for me, not academically, but just, looking back now, finding nervous system regulation in a school was hard for me. And between switching schools, skipping grades, changing classrooms, when things weren't working for me, I probably moved around like 8 different times by the time I was done with high school. I had a lot of autonomy, like even at 9 years old, I remember my best friend and I walking down probably 7 blocks across a main drag to a strip mall to be able to like buy candy and ice cream on our own with no time limit, no cell phones, this is before those days, basically go on an adventure as long as we were home at some point, And my dad in particular very much treated me like a peer. So, for example, when I was in 4th grade, my dad was getting his doctorate in music composition from UCLA. And for one of his classes, he had to write an original piece, an electronic music composition for dance students in the dance graduate program to perform to. And he was dreading it. He was complaining to my mom about it. And I was 8 years old and I said, I'll help you. And even though I was only 8, he said, okay. Part of the composition was pre-recorded electronic music, and part of it was free improvisation, which basically just means making it up on the spot. I was on flute. My dad was on the piano. We were going to be using extended techniques, which means like using the instruments in non-traditional ways. So like scratching the piano strings with coins or tossing coins at the piano strings or, doing lip trills on the flute to make it sound weird or overblowing, just things that you wouldn't normally hear in like a classical music concert. And in case you're sensing a theme here, yes, my dad's music is also very outside the box. And the dance was mostly improvisational, but we did have rehearsal. And during the rehearsal, I was instructing my dad. I was instructing the dancers. Nobody gave me permission to do this. My dad wasn't like, okay, Kendahl, you're at the helm. It was just like, that was my natural instinct, was to guide everybody and tell everybody what to do. And my dad has since told me that his instinct was to stop me because it was inappropriate, right? I was 8 years old with a bunch of graduate students telling them what to do for an assignment that wasn't my own. But he says that he paused and he reminded himself that he agreed to make me a collaborator. And so he kept his mouth shut. So in front of a full audience of music and dance graduate students, really esteemed professors, my dad, me, and the dancers improvised an original piece. And when we got to the end, my dad had been conducting, and so he was signaling the end of the piece, like you see a conductor do. And I didn't agree that it was the end of the piece. So I just kept playing, and which meant that the dancers kept dancing because I didn't have a sense of hierarchy. For me, my respect was reserved for the art and the creation, not for who was supposed to say that it was done. So when it finally felt right to me, I ended the piece. And after all the performances were over, a member of the faculty from the music department came up to my dad and said, it was your daughter who kept that piece together. And my dad was like, I know. And I say that not to toot my own horn, but really as an example of the level, like the true unreserved level of autonomy and equality that my parents afforded me. It was not symbolic, it was real. And it was deeply, deeply regulating for me because my mind never naturally focused on hierarchy. It was focused on interests and meaning and art and concepts and imaginary worlds and books and all of these things that I was interested in, but it was never hierarchy unless someone else was trying to enforce it, in which case I was distracted from everything else by a lot of like rage and vibration building in my body. So when I look back at my childhood, I can also identify other ways that I was accommodated that I now realize are like part of those 4S's. Obviously I didn't then, but for instance, I was the older sibling of only 2 siblings, and I'm 3.5 years older than my sisters. And my mom was a flute teacher, and she taught from home, and she taught in the afternoons after kids got out of school. So for about 3 solid years, I had extensive one-to-one co-regulation from my mom for the whole day. And when she was teaching, I had a babysitter, one babysitter that came all the time who I had a really strong relationship with. I also sought out other nervous systems. I mean, throughout my childhood, we had not all at one time, but we had 5 dogs, 3 cats, 4 rabbits, 2 rats. I would do homework with a rat hanging out on my shoulder, just like I wouldn't do my homework unless my rat was on my shoulder. When I was really little, I would go in my backyard and catch bluebelly lizards and, as embarrassing as it is to say, have conversations with them. So I was like convinced that we could talk to each other. I would ask them yes or no questions. And if they closed their right eye, they were answering yes. If they closed their left eye, they were answering no. Both eyes meant maybe. And so I learned so much about these lizards. But it was really about connecting with another nervous system, right? So that was something that I naturally spent my time doing. Like if my parents weren't available, I found it somewhere else. And I might not have had unlimited access to screens because I'm an 80s baby, but I was a voracious reader and I almost always had a book in my hands. I would spend recesses alone reading in an abandoned sandbox or swing. I probably read the book Matilda by Roald Dahl cover to cover upwards of 70 times. And most of my hours at home were spent reading. And the characters in these books really felt like my friends. I think it's similar to how some of us now will like watch TV shows over and over, and especially like group casts, right? Where we really kind of we're one of the gang and we have our friends hanging out with us, even if that's not like consciously what we're thinking. That's kind of the vibe, right? And for the characters in these books, I could flesh them out in my mind. I could feel what they felt, and our nervous systems were really linked, even though it was in my mind, right? When I turned 8, my grandparents gave me a boombox for my birthday, and music, the daughter of 2 musicians, music is deeply regulating for me. And so I would spend hours on my floor just listening to music, or reading with the newest CD playing as a soundtrack to what I was reading. I also had, rotating special interests, which my parents were totally supportive of, which ranged from catching lizards to collecting things. Like I was really into the gears of analog watches. I mean, super specific, strange things, right? I was really into playing music for a while. I loved collecting road signs, reading, collecting rocks and gems. I was also really naturally drawn towards transformation activities. So I would turn everything in front of me into something else. So like grass blades would become whistles, cat hair, like we had this cat who would brush and her cat hair would be all over the grass and I would like twist it up into yarn and try to like spin it. I would cut up every magazine we had and make really intricate collages. I loved wordplay and puns and was always turning one word into something else or one meaning into something else. These were my natural tendencies. And, looking back again, I could see that I was naturally accommodating myself with these four S's. But when I think about like, why was I able to do that independently and some kids aren't? I have to speculate that part of the reason I could access them so relatively independently is because I was so well accommodated by my parents. And because of that, I must have had a very large window before reaching my threshold of tolerance, right? So I was spending time in the part of my brain that could access these natural tendencies rather than in the part of my brain that couldn't. So I want to talk a little bit also about my internalized experiences of dysregulation. Again, since so many examples that we have are of externalized PDAers, I want to take a little time to explore how I, as an internalized PDAer, experienced dysregulation as a young child and how it shifted as my window started to get smaller as I entered high school and beyond into college and first jobs. So, as I mentioned before, as a very small child, I had intense tantrums and I eloped. But my mom used extinction and the externalized tantrums stopped, and they stopped before I reached the age when they would be considered inappropriate. Then the elopement stopped too. But the dysregulation didn't. It just moved inside. And part of me wonders whether there really is a difference between externalized and internalized presentations other than internalized PDAers maybe being more able to like recruit appeasement, like I think that there might be something to like all of us having a nervous system response, but maybe some of us are going into appeasement and some of us are going into fight flight without that recruiting that social piece. So as young as 4 years old, I remember in my head vividly imagining doing all the things my nervous system physically wanted to do. So I had intricate fantasies of stealing a handkerchief from my mom's flute case that she used to clean her flute and like wrapping up my most important possessions, tying it to a stick, throwing it over my shoulder like a bindle, and running away while my parents were asleep. And instead of throwing tantrums, I would go into my room and, like I said, close the door and bite my arm as hard as I could, right? I wasn't biting my mom. I wasn't biting my dad. I wasn't biting my sister, but I was biting someone. But I was doing it in a way that wasn't going to throw off anybody's, like, it wasn't going to appear socially inappropriate because nobody was seeing it. And as I got older, I would imagine an elaborate castle far, far away. And it had a tower with an extensive flight of stairs. And I would run up this flight of stairs to the farthest edge and highest point, and I would imagine myself escaping there. And in my most threatened moments, I would imagine myself going to sleep there and never waking up, very like Sleeping Beauty. But knowing what I know now, I can see that these like very easily link to externalized responses, right? They're like the literal internalization of my nervous system responses. The instinct towards fight with biting my arm, the instinct towards flight with running away, and the instinct towards freeze with falling asleep and never waking up. So I talked a lot about how my parents accommodated me and why, one of the reasons I think I was relatively regulated as a kid, but things started to get harder as I got older. The week before I turned 14 marked the first in like a cascade of changes in my life. I had a medical emergency. I woke up feeling pain in my abdomen and ended the day in emergency surgery to remove borderline tumor the size of a golf ball that had twisted my ovary around 3 times. So that in and of itself was an incredible loss of autonomy. But there were also so many additional losses of autonomy and equality just in my interactions with the medical system on that day, right? I had doctors and nurses questioning my promiscuity as a 13-year-old who'd never kissed anybody. I had to undergo a pelvic ultrasound at 13 years old. I was put under anesthesia. I had to take out my earrings that I'd just gotten my ears double and triple pierced, and I had to take those out for surgery, and I knew that they were going to close up. And of course, like I had to have my body cut open and pieces of it removed, right? And so all of these real, but also neurocepted threats to autonomy and equality were accumulating. But the straw that kind of broke the camel's back happened a day or two later after they removed the catheter. So before I could leave the hospital, I had to prove to the nurses that I could urinate on my own. And a nurse had to escort me and my IV stand to the bathroom, into the bathroom. So I wasn't going in autonomously or on my own. I had to use a toilet insert so they could measure how much I peed. And the nurse waited outside, and it was taking me a long time to relax enough to be able to go. And she would knock on the door, really loud. Are you okay in there? Is everything okay? Do you need anything? Which logically makes sense. This is like a young girl who's just had, major surgery, and she's taking a long time in the bathroom, and you want to make sure she isn't like fainted and doesn't need assistance, right? But I could feel my whole body descend into panic. And finally, I managed to pee. But for the next decade of my life, I couldn't urinate in the presence of anyone at all. Like completely lost access to this basic need. I would withhold during breaks in high school and wait until I was in the middle of class when I knew people wouldn't be in the bathroom and then ask to go. When my now husband and I started living together, he would have to be dead asleep or he would have to leave the house in order for me to pee in our bathroom. I once went 12 to 14 hours when traveling across the country without going to the bathroom, because even though there were family restrooms in the airports, like the loudspeaker felt to me like somebody was there in the room with me, or I couldn't be sure that there wasn't somebody on the other side of the door waiting. And it always felt like this pressure, and I just couldn't relax. And then, within a year after my surgery, my parents separated and divorced. I transitioned from a small, very accommodating private school to a huge public high school. College was nearing, so pressures to perform were increasing. And I just started dropping things left and right. I'd been a competitive classical flute player since I was 6 years old. I had been on television and on stage with celebrities playing flute, and I stopped playing completely. Voice is my other instrument. I was still taking voice lessons, which I actually preferred because it felt more autonomous. I mean, it's my actual voice rather than having something else vibrate sound for me. But I stopped practicing. I stopped doing any of my homework, either at all or doing it like the morning of or the class before, just enough to keep my grades. I completely forgot about the PSATs, and like all of my friends came to school to take them with having studied and taking classes, and I didn't even know what was happening that day. I stopped reading books altogether, and I am narcoleptic. I didn't know at that time, but I am. But it got much worse in high school, which is also typical for narcoleptics. But I was sleeping through every single class and sleeping for the entire afternoon when I got home from school. So in hindsight, I think that some of it was probably also freeze. In my senior year, I dropped all of my AP classes. I didn't apply to a single college, and I was a straight A student, but I spent all of my energy on special interests within school, so theater and show choir. But because my grades never suffered, nobody thought to ask questions. And after I graduated, I got a job at Trader Joe's. I worked in the milk box because I was too young to be a cashier, and I liked it because it was just like time by myself to think. It was like a very repetitive job, and there was no pressure associated with it. And outside of my job, I slept, and I didn't know it then, but I think I was just trying to recover from a burnout that I had entered. And it looked very different from what I had looked like as a child. So after the summer that I graduated from high school, I was craving some dopamine and novelty. So I applied to Indiana University because they had a musical theater program and I knew somebody who had gone there. And I went for a semester and then dropped out. I wasn't ready to go. And I couldn't major in my special interest, which was non-classical voice, because it didn't exist. So while I was there, I had decided to try and petition to get the major instated because they had it for graduate students, but not for undergraduate students. And when one day my dad and my sister had flown out to Indiana to visit, and they were eating breakfast at a B&B that they were staying in. And at this point, I'd already organized the petition. I'd submitted it. I'd done a bunch of legwork to help move this major forward. And as it turns out, the chair of the graduate music program was staying in the B&B because his partner was visiting from wherever she was living at the time. And he was telling her over breakfast with my dad and sister there, he didn't know who they were, about this annoying redheaded undergraduate who was trying to get a non-classical voice major approved, and it was never going to happen. Eye roll, the whole thing. And that was it. That was the moment I was like, I can't be here anymore. And I feel it's very fitting with my PDA profile, right? Like just this total loss of autonomy in terms of being able to just study what I wanted to study. And there was no way that I was going to make it work otherwise. So I struggled immensely during my college years. You know, I flitted from one thing to the next, trying to move forward and just like not being able to. At a certain point, I moved in with my grandparents. I went to beauty school and I quit when I only had 200 hours left to go. I worked in retail and grocery and tried to find my footing. And that was, you know, I started to kind of come out of burnout bit by bit. I started reading again after years of not picking up a book. I remember there was this bookstore where I was living that it's just kind of like that quintessential nook of a bookstore with books everywhere and on the floor. And I would just go in and like every few days go in, pick up another book that was on the floor, buy it, go home, read it, go back. And just, I read like an incredible amount that year. But at the same time, like my room was a disaster. Okay, like beyond. And when I moved out of my grandparents' house for a little bit to live with roommates from work, I couldn't clean the room. Like my dad had to drive 2 hours up from LA to Santa Barbara to clean my room for me. And this is for like a gifted, highly intelligent, highly aware human. I literally couldn't clean my own room. That was beyond my capabilities at that point. Eventually, I moved back in with my grandmother. My grandfather had passed away at this point, and I started at the community college there and started taking pre-med classes. I loved it. And I excelled and I transferred to a really prestigious liberal arts college and then almost immediately descended into another burnout. I stopped sleeping at night, had to start taking medication in order to sleep. I had difficulty attending my classes or getting there on time. And the losses of autonomy just from being in a school environment that had such high expectations felt so great that I was almost constantly in a state of internalized nervous system threat response, looking back. My body was vibrating all the time. I still wasn't able to pee within the vicinity of anybody. I wasn't able to sleep, etc. And I really loved being around so many bright, interesting people. And at the same time, like I no longer had my built-in equality accommodation of always being the most accomplished in the room. So everyone around me was super ambitious, earning fellowships and scholarships and research foundation grants and doing, studies abroad. And I couldn't even figure out like how to eat in the dining hall without having a nervous system response to the salad bar being closed in the mornings because I didn't have a choice of whether or not I could put cucumbers on my toast or spinach with my eggs, right? And deadlines for assignments were paralyzing to me. I would turn in papers a semester late sometimes. I took 2 medical leaves of absence, and I went so deep into burnout that I couldn't even access my own voice anymore. I lost total access to my social engagement system. I couldn't sing, I couldn't perform, I couldn't remember words, I had no access to creativity. And like during one of my medical leaves, the way that I was paying rent, I was still living in the same area where I was going to school in an apartment. And the way that I paid rent was as a merchandiser for Urban Outfitters. And I couldn't even do my job anymore. Like I remember staring at like a size run of new shirts. And my job was just to like decide where they went. But for 2 hours, just staring at them and not being able to do that, to just say, let's put this at the front of the store or the back, right? During this time, I lost every single one of my close friendships from school and from childhood, except for my very best friend from elementary school. But even then, I missed her wedding. I missed these huge milestones in her life. I couldn't be present at all. I couldn't send her a gift for a wedding. I couldn't call her to congratulate her. I was like, I mean, it's like a testament to her that that friendship has survived. I was totally absent. And it took me 8 years to get through my undergraduate. 8 years after graduated from high school, I finally graduated from college. And, by the grace of my talents and the accommodations of my safest professors, and I moved at this point to San Francisco with my now husband, where I entered the workforce. And again, I entered into another burnout. The losses of equality of working for other people when there's like a very clear hierarchy. I have this memory of I was working for this as a grant writer for this philanthropic organization, and the executive director, in like what in a movie would be like a friendly move by a higher up, sat on my desk above me, with her arms crossed, just trying to be like friendly and casual. And I just started shaking and crying, like because here was this woman who's the head of the entire organization sitting above me on my desk and asking me direct questions. And I was just trembling, crying. Like I was so inappropriate in that situation. And I had no control over it whatsoever. I was a grant writer, which is a horrible job for a PDAer because there are deadlines all the time. Like my entire job was managing deadlines. And I still couldn't pee in public spaces. So I'd go the entire workday without urinating. And it became difficult for me to socialize. I had to take medicine to sleep again. And I just felt frozen in fear all the time. I stopped doing any music. I stopped listening to music. When my husband and I got married, I couldn't even attend any events surrounding my wedding outside of our actual wedding, except for a bachelorette food tour with my very closest friends at the time, which was an extremely small group of safe nervous systems. And after 3 years of working with my family supporting me financially, I quit my job to try and get pregnant. I was on narcolepsy medication in order to work, but without the narcolepsy medication, I couldn't stay awake at a desk job. And I couldn't take that if I was going to try to get pregnant. So at this point, I was so burnt out, even though I had no job, which meant that many of my previous work pressures were removed. It was taking me time to recover. And on top of it all, I suffered a miscarriage early on and then had challenges for a year after that getting pregnant. And that was such an intense loss of autonomy on top of the burnout left over from working and from school and, all of these things that had accumulated over years where, I'd gone down, come back up, gone down, come back up. That for a whole year, I sat on the couch and I watched The Office and How I Met Your Mother. And that was it. That was it. This is in my mid-20s, And, my husband was in the midst of getting his doctorate, and he would come home to me in the exact same spot that he had left me on our couch with my iPad. The apartment was a mess. I hadn't showered. The kitchen was a disaster. And to be honest, like it looked a lot like what we see a lot of our kids doing too. Like when I look at burnout and I hear everybody's stories about burnout, that's what I looked like in my mid-20s. I got a dog at this point because I desperately needed that nervous system co-regulation. I didn't know that then, but I just needed a dog, period. And we weren't allowed dogs in our apartment, but I lobbied my landlord with the force of a thousand suns, emails, texts, calls, everything, like a point by point presentation on why I was getting a dog and why it would be okay for the apartment. And the dog was great, gave me nervous system co-regulation, because my husband was getting his doctorate. He wasn't home a lot, even though we lived right next to campus, right? He was working from morning till night and I was alone and I needed some being there. And then I finally got pregnant with my oldest and I started to recover. And parenting became my special interest at that point, and I devoured stacks of books on gentle parenting and respectful parenting. I went for walks with the dog. I was finally able to get out of the house. And when my son was born, parenting was regulating, like I had another nervous system around all the time. There were no deadlines. I just had important, purposeful tasks like diaper changes and feeding that were autonomous. Like, of course, I'd want to do that because I want to take care of my son, right? But as I had more and more kids, and I have four, my children started getting more and more dysregulated. And then, because I had less time and attention for each of them simply because of how many there were. And the presence of another sibling in and of itself was a loss of equality for each kid as the next one came along and thus dysregulating. And when my kids were very young, I had a lot of systems in place to give me control. I had systems to keep the house clean, systems to keep my children clean, to get them to sleep, to stay within our single earner postdoc salary budget, to be able to leave the house and expose my children to playgrounds and botanical gardens and splash parks and farmers markets, creek beds, ice cream, etc., like spontaneous adventure. In the back of our car, I had what I called the oh shit box, which was where I kept like diapers and wipes and changes of clothing and non-melting snacks and bathing suits and towels, like literally everything I thought that I would need when things got unpredictable. But as my children grew more and more dysregulated, the things that I needed in those unpredictable moments stopped fitting in that box. And, like what am I going to pack to keep my older sons, Jamie and Stefan, from throwing a training potty filled with urine against the walls when we get home from an adventure? What am I going to use to stop Jamie and Stefan from emptying our entire sensory bin full of rice over the entire first floor of our house just while I'm nursing the baby for 20 minutes, And like, sure, I can give my daughter headphones when the screaming gets so loud that she stops being able to walk. But how do I get her to wear them? Where's the device for that? What could I give my baby that he would actually eat? And like, were there any plates that he wouldn't be able to smash into a million pieces on the ground or rip or tear, right? And my kids were like child-proofing hackers. Like if there was a way to remove something that was in place for safety and endanger themselves, they would find it. Magnetiles became missiles. Our couch was ripped open and the stuffing sprinkled everywhere that the littles could choke on. My kids would climb over 4-foot tall baby gates and backyard fencing. They would unlock everything that was locked. And I couldn't keep Jamie from Rose. He seemed totally intent on harming her, as if his own life depended on it. One time I had to take Stefan to the hospital to get staples in his scalp because Jamie hit him over the head with a pair of kitchen tongs that he was using for a sensory motor activity. I took Jamie to the hospital once to glue his lip where his tooth went through because Stefan had thrown a mirror in his face in dysregulation. I took Harlan to the hospital for stitches because I told him not to jump in the bathtub, so he jumped in the bathtub and slipped and hit his chin. And I was constantly picking Rose up and carrying her to safety because she couldn't walk away from threat. And around this time, I also started to recognize that my own internal reactions that I was having towards my kids or around my kids stopped feeling aligned with how I felt about my kids cognitively or emotionally, or like how I felt about being a parent, or even how I identified being human, right? So I started noticing that I was needing to give myself the best plate of food, whether it was like more aesthetically pleasing or a larger portion size. I started noticing that I wanted my kids to understand how they were inconveniencing me if something didn't go to plan. Like if they made a mess of their clothes right before we were supposed to leave the house, or had a blowout diaper in an inconvenient place, or stomped in a puddle so hard that things got wet that shouldn't have. And like these were all normal kid things to do. And I knew they were normal kid things to do. And at the same time, I was feeling victimized and I was having like physical reactions. And I just couldn't understand why I felt so like justifiably upset about things that other parents were brushing off or finding cute. And, I had this vision of myself as artistic and free and unconditionally loving. And yet at the same time, if my kid didn't follow directions or made a mess, I had such strong dysregulation. I would take my kids outside to play in the mud and the rain and cognitively. I'm like, I love this idea. It's so free, it's so earthy, so in line with like who I am as a person and as a parent. And then like the second we get outside, I would just feel vibration through my entire body, tightness in my chest. Outings started to feel oppressive, having to gather everything the kids needed, the diapers, water bottles, cut up fruit, etc. And, potty training was like another circle of hell. And looking back, it was like a complete loss of autonomy, right? Because when the kids were in diapers, I was in charge of when their toileting needs got addressed. I was able to change their diaper when it suited me. Like even if 5 minutes passed because I needed to wait to take something out of the oven, like that's fine because they're in a diaper. But the second they're not in a diaper, if they have to go to the bathroom, it's right now, right? And I noticed that was like I was yelling more whenever I would potty train my kids. And I'm not a yeller, but I would, and I had a very short fuse. And eventually my dog became too dysregulating, the unpredictability of her barking, especially like as it disrupted my kids' nap schedules or sleeping and like needing to take her on a walk. And it just was too much for me. And I began to see the dog as a threat, even though I was a huge animal lover. So it was like all these very confusing dichotomies between what I was feeling and what I would value and think that I should be feeling. And we ended up having to rehome the dog. But yeah, the biggest thing wasn't the fact that I was experiencing dysregulation, because obviously every parent at one time or another is feeling dysregulation, especially with like 4 small kids at home, but even with one, right? But what really ticked me off to the fact that something was different was that the dysregulation and the reasons I was getting dysregulated didn't match who I identified myself to be. So when I finally came to PDA, I had some experiences where I started to recognize my own need for accommodation. Like when I finally took the leap and enrolled in the paradigm shift program, I was in or pretty close to burnout, and I didn't have much of a window. And I'd started recognizing that like these things that didn't match in my experiences of parenting versus my identity might track with PDA and my, lack of access, loss of access to certain basic needs. So I started to recognize myself as PDA, and I took everything in. I devoured all the course materials. I was at every class. I mean, it was just like, I've got to figure this out right now. And I was totally dedicated to implementing accommodations, tracking, etc. And then one weekend, and I actually realized today that it was one weekend from this weekend exactly, like exactly a year ago, my husband had to attend an academic conference for work. And I had all kids on my own, all 4 kids from Friday to Sunday. But like the optics were good, right? I had the fridge stocked, the house was clean, laundry is done. I felt regulated. I had all these tools under my belt from the class. Like I could do this, I had everything that we needed and everything should have been fine, but it was horrible. It was extremely difficult. And even with all of these new tools at my disposal, tools that like in a normal course of a week, I could successfully access the majority of the time, I was completely unable to access them at all by the end of the weekend. And I'd moved into complete dysregulation. I was biting my arm again. I was fantasizing about running away into that internal fortress, falling asleep, and never waking up. And at first, I felt like such great shame, like questioning, how can I descend into this place when I have all these tools in front of me? I know what I need to do. Why can't I not do it? And I felt shame that I was failing to provide for my family in the manner that I wanted to. But what shifted things for me was when I started to think about that same weekend through a disability framework for myself. So I looked at my own data as an internalized PDAer. I started equalizing against myself, biting my arm to the point of bruising to release meltdown energy. My sensory sensitivities were much more debilitating. I was losing access to sleep, which at this point in my life is my stickiest basic need. And when I looked at the 4 S's, I could see what was missing. The presence of a safe nervous system, because my husband wasn't there. The ability to engage in a special interest and get into a flow state, because I was staying up late cleaning and, dealing with the kids. I had no time to read or research interests after the kids went to bed. And underneath it all, of course, is like the constant demands of 4 demand avoidant children, which were constant threats to my autonomy. So when my husband got back that Sunday afternoon, immediately I started to be able to regulate better. Like I literally felt instant nervous system relief when he walked in the door. And the next day I took off completely and he stayed with the kids instead of me. And I got out of the house with no demands to come back until I felt like coming back. And I started to feel myself come back into my abilities, right? It was the shift from here to here. And once back in the house, I was able to access those same knowledge and skills that I gained from the program. And what I felt this experience give me was three things. One was a better understanding of what my PDAers experience themselves in their own nervous system, that there really is a cognitive block when they're dysregulated, even if I think they should be able to like do better because they know better. Because here I was, an adult who was nearing the end of a 3-month course on this paradigm shift, and I had zero access to the teachings that weekend, right? Like if I couldn't access that, then I needed to start believing my kids that they couldn't access what they knew when they were telling me that they couldn't. I also started to recognize how important is to accommodate myself, to accommodate my own nervous system if I want to see change, right? Both for the kids and for myself. So I realized like there's great power in having a regulated nervous system around, both as a regulator for me and also as a demand reducer. Like I could delegate things either for caregiving or in some ways for myself, like having somebody bring me a glass of water. And, being a PDAer myself, my first language is energy, right? And if I have another safe, regulated nervous system around, I have more of a choice to tap into that energy rather than the dysregulated energy of my kids. So the way that I've kind of felt about it since is like putting on the right song. Like if you have like an upbeat pop hit rather than like a tear-inducing ballad, right? Or like reading a humor column or funny memes instead of like reading an intense novel about human suffering. So it's more than about putting me in the right mood, though. It's like literally drawing and coloring my surroundings from the energy. Like the energy is the paint and the medium and the colors. And I also gained a better understanding of recovery time required after tipping over the threshold of tolerance. Even with all my supports back in place and much of my regulation regained, I was exhausted and closer to my threshold of tolerance for a couple of weeks after this particular weekend. My sensory sensitivities were still more pronounced. I accidentally cut myself while preparing food a few days after. So overall, that experience really helped me realize that while it's easy to write off my kids' behavior as just kids being difficult, that it isn't the truth. And I was able to gain a lot of clarity around why being under-resourced is not only triggering, but disabling, and why accommodation is so critically important, which has informed my agency in accommodating my kids. So I'll talk a little bit about like finding my agency. So since then, I focused really intently on finding my own agency and accommodating my kids, not just the immediate reason, but also the guiding reasons for accommodating them, even though it technically increases demands on me. So for me, my guiding purpose is to show my kids love for them, even in their most difficult moments, to like show them love without condition, without reservation. And just thinking that allows me to show my kids to accommodate them without burning out because I have purpose in doing so, right? And that's probably the greatest accommodation that I have for myself these days because it's my nervous system's greatest need to have autonomy as crucially and availably as oxygen. And when I am truly choosing to accommodate my kids, I am regulating myself. And sometimes I also choose not to accommodate my kids because my nervous system needs something else more, which also helps to remind me that it truly is a choice to accommodate or not, right? It's not something that's brought upon me. I am choosing this every time I do it. And I've also put effort into accommodating myself more pragmatically. So that includes dropping demands where I'm able, like maybe not changing into pajamas at the end of the night, or I've invited a housekeeper in who's a safe nervous system for me multiple days a week. I've streamlined our cooking. I've locked in the attic all the toys like sensory bin rice that like end up all over the floor of the house that like really dysregulate me when they're not played with in a way that I can handle. I've started wearing what's essentially a uniform. Like, yes, I'm wearing a dress today, but most of the time I have 6 pairs of overalls, 3 short, 3 long, and I wear that with shirts. I don't have to think about it. I've pared down my social calendar. I respond to texts only when I have the energy to do that. And so, my parenting right now is still challenging, right? Like I still have 4 PDA kids, but what is pretty cool is that even in the midst of this extremely challenging and taxing parenting gig, like I'm not in burnout anymore. And that's from changing myself, right? Not my kids. And I've rebuilt friendships from childhood that I lost in my 20s. Next week, actually, one of my best friends from middle school, whose wedding I also missed when I was in a burnout, who I was a bridesmaid and dropped out of the wedding the weekend before and then didn't contact for years. We're going to see each other and our kids are going to meet next week. I've found my joy again. I can laugh. I can be silly with my kids without literally feeling like it might cost me my life. I'm working for the first time in over a decade. I'm reading again. I'm excited to see my kids in the morning, even when I haven't gotten enough sleep. And I can appreciate them for who they are without trying to make them into something that they're not. And I can recognize my own signs of dysregulation and choose to accommodate myself more deeply, even if it's entirely within the confines of my own mind. And my kids, too, are in a completely different place than they were before. We've been intensively accommodating them for almost a year and a half, and things still don't look at all like how I imagined they would. And I don't expect they ever will. But there's joy and there's calm and there's love and there's friendship. There's respect and self-awareness and compromise and there's growth. And I see it rippling out from each of them. For instance, like Rose and Jamie, who for a long time couldn't be safely in a room together at all. They play imaginary games together and they help each other with games on their tablet. Jamie has a special club with his 2 best friends from school. That's like an acronym of the first initial, of all of their names. And now Rose's R is part of that secret club name. Jamie has started recognizing his own threat response and he taught Rose how to recognize hers. The other night, he set a boundary with her and she got upset. She threw a pillow at him and he diffused it and she started sobbing. But she was telling me how she'd wanted to be closer to Jamie. And when he asked her to get out of his orbit, she goes, I had my threat response and I threw a pillow at him. And that's how we grow, right? That self-awareness. And I sat with her through the pain and she actually let me hold her and stroke her hair, which is like unheard of. She's not a kid who likes to be touched. And like these moments are still hard, right? Like they're still screaming, they're still sobbing, they're still crying, there's still an internal, you know, like gasp and wanting to make sure that they're not hurting each other, right? But they're also openings to model for our kids how they can accommodate themselves and to encourage just by being there, the fact that when they do accommodate themselves, it's okay, right? The other day I caught Stefan, who's 8, kissing Harlan, who's 4, on the head and telling him that he loved him. A week ago, I overheard Jamie tell Stefan that he could give him a stick in Minecraft. And Stefan goes, no, but thank you for the offer. And Jamie goes, yeah, I was just being generous. And Stefan goes, yeah, I like it when you're generous. Just like very kind speech about a kind thing that I just never thought I would hear. And the last story that I want to share is from this last Mother's Day. So we had no plans or expectations for the day because personal special events can just really dysregulate everybody in our house. So unless it's like a birthday that a kid wants, we're not doing it. My husband, he's a professor and he had to go, it was during his finals and he had to give a final from 7 to 10 p.m. and he had to write the final that day and go and print it, etc. So on Mother's Day, I spent the majority of the day as the sole adult with all 4 PDA kids, bringing them food, picking up their things, helping them problem solve, lending my nervous system, all the things. I wasn't able to shower until 2. There was zero fanfare. And around 4:30, I started prepping dinner and my husband had come home just so I could prep dinner in between him finishing his final and going to give it. And he was the safe nervous system with the kids, so I could cook. But by the time he had to leave, I hadn't quite finished cooking. And I was like fully ready, like in full acceptance. I'm going to have to turn off the stove and give the kids cereal for dinner. And that's just what it is tonight. But my husband left, and all the kids voluntarily put down their screens and played together for 45 minutes. And then when Stefan started using his iPad again, he invited Rose to watch, which he usually hates when she watches. So it was like a very pointed bid for connection. And at this point, I was making tacos. I had like 12 tortillas left to make. And Jamie, my 7-year-old, bounded into the kitchen and he goes, "It's pretty cool that people can have happy lives, even if miserable things happen." And I went, "Yeah, you're so right. Like, what makes you think of that?" He goes, "It's me, because I have a lot of things that happen in my life that I don't like, but I also have lots of things that happen in my life that I do like. So if I focus on those, then that's the key to a happy life." Which is just like great life advice, first of all, but also like what a shift in perspective for my most externalizing PDAer, right? And he then asked to help me finish making the tortillas, and we just like cooked and hung out together, and it was like a normal moment, He talked to me about things in his life, and I had completely given up on any connection looking like this with my kids, right? And then this kid, who a month earlier we had to pull from school, or had decided to pull from school because we noticed that his basic needs were slipping. He had gone down to 2 foods. He was just eating bean and cheese burritos and peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. And I was prepared to make either of those for him on top of what I was already cooking for others. He decided to eat 2 of the tacos that we made, which were tacos de lengua, which, if you don't speak Spanish or aren't Mexican, those are tongue tacos. Okay, this kid who literally wasn't eating anything but bean and cheese burritos and peanut butter and jelly ate 2 of these tacos with homemade salsa, with chopped onions, with cilantro. And that night, I put everyone to bed by myself. My husband was giving the final, and there was no violence. It was calm. There was no screaming. And that was Mother's Day. There was no brunch. There were no flowers. Nobody wished me a happy Mother's Day. I did everything for everybody else, and it was like the best Mother's Day ever. And the last thing I'll say is that, I think that part of the grief that I experienced when confronting the idea of intensively accommodating my kids was letting go of the image of life that I brought with me into parenthood, right? And even as we recover and we find our new equilibrium, like, it never looks the same as what I pictured. It's legitimately hard. But I think one of the biggest lessons that I've learned in this reorganization of my life and priorities is that it's not like life or a lack of obstacles that determines whether our paths are joyous or peaceful or purposeful, right? It's us. Like, we're the ones that get to decide. Like, we're the ones with the agency to choose connection and to choose love and to choose to acknowledge the challenges and also see the glimmers, and to see the progress in the minutia, to recognize and honor our differences and our children's differences, our disabilities, right? So that we can live our lives as our full, honest, accommodated selves. And I think more than anything, I've learned that hope is always present, and times may be dark, but we're in control of our light. And, working with all of you, I see that the light is in each and every one of you too.
Beautiful, Kendahl. Wow, that was amazing. Thank you. I love it. Well, this was such a powerful session. I hope that you enjoyed it, Kendahl.
I did.
You're going to be tired afterwards.
I'll go collapse and be comatose for a few hours.
Yes,
No.
indeed, indeed. But thank you all for participating, and I just really loved this. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you guys so much. Thank you all for being here. It was really, I appreciate your presence. Thank you, Casey, for giving me the forum.
Yeah. All right, friends, have a good day.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone, for being here with me at the At Peace Parents podcast. This is your source for all things related to understanding, supporting, accommodating, and advocating for your PDA child. To go deeper on any of these topics, check out my course offerings and masterclasses at the website www.atpeaceparents.com. To completely transform the way you think about and relate to your child and to bring peace and stability to your home, join us for the next cohort of the Paradigm Shift program.